Getting into the interview itself, right? We always advise candidates to stick to the STARCH method where you can. I mean, it's not always applicable, but when you're asked a direct question, Greg, tell me about a time you worked on a project, or tell me about a time that you had a challenge or a difficult teammate. The STARCH method is a great way to a great framework to use to conceptualize that and tell a story. We've done our homework. We're ready for the interview. The STARCH method, situation, task, action, response, and change. So starting out with the situation, you're asked a question. Tell me a project that you worked on where you experienced a challenge or a difficulty, or you drove it to success, whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. This is just a framework for you to onboard the question and put it in this framework where your answer is very clear and direct in terms of what they want. So the situation, I worked on this project, or we were working on this major project, implementing a new system, revamping AR, AP processes, whatever the case is. The task, this is what I actually did, right? Or me and the group did. This was the work stream we were delivering on. So talk about that, right? The action, again, some of the tasks that you took, get more granular there and say, I did these things specifically to advance it forward, right? After action is response or results. That's where you actually delivered the work on time and under budget. Or I think this is an important thing to acknowledge in an interview. Acknowledge the mistakes or the challenges, right? That shows growth, and we'll get to that in the change piece. The change is, what would you have done differently? So let's say this project went off 95% without a problem, right? When you're around other professionals, typically that is the case. You all are kind of responsible for your work stream. Everybody does their piece, and usually it's a good job, but there's always challenges, whether it be a challenging teammate or a vendor that you're working with that maybe didn't come through on their end of the bargain. Could be numerous different things, but acknowledge that and then talk about what you learned from that and what you would change in the future. So we had this challenge, or I had a mistake or a stumble here. Here's what I learned from it, and here's what I do differently in the future. It kind of humanizes you a little bit and kind of shows that you're thinking through what those changes in actions or behaviors would be in the future.
Yeah. I mean, you realize that not everything always works out. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, being relatable, admitting to, when things go wrong or have gone wrong. And the hiring manager is going to relate to that, right? Because you could say, hey, our project was this. Our goal was to get it to, X, Y, Z, but we fell short because of this and that, right? And that'll allow for the manager to say, yeah, same thing happened to us, right? Like, we've had issues like that in the past.
And the response and the results piece really speaks to what we spoke about earlier, Greg, with quantifying your professional achievements, right? It's not, I just worked on this project, period. It's, we actually delivered a result. We reduced the time it takes to do something by 30% by automating those AP and AR processes, or we generated revenue because we worked through a business transformation that changed the way that we do whatever it is, right? So really important to have those numbers quantified, dollar signs, percentages, whatever it is. So, yeah.
So back to what Greg said earlier, know your made, saved, and achieved. If you don't know your made, saved, and achieved, it's going to be really hard for someone to work through that STARCH method.
Yep.
In a concise format. And, one thing I do tell candidates always, yes, you want to storytell in the interview and with the STARCH method, but if you give too many details, people are going to get lost in the details and they won't remember what's important. So that's where the made, saved, and achieved is extraordinarily important in the STARCH method. And I like to say, talk in bullet point format. Think about, okay, if I'm going to write this out in bullet point, what does it look like, so that you can be more direct, more concise, and so people can leave the interview remembering what you shared with them.
Land the plane. Okay, so great advice there. I mean, I think as well, don't ramble, right? To Amy's point exactly, you want to keep your responses somewhere between like 90 to 120 seconds. So at most, we're talking a couple minutes here, right? Anything more than that, you might lose interest, or you might run the risk of, again, rambling and, not tying back to the previous point.
I always tell people, if you feel like you're talking too much, you probably are.
Yeah. Well, you want to keep it conversational. You want to allow the interviewer to ask some questions and create a dialogue.
Yeah, I've had interviews before where I call the manager afterwards. I'm like, oh, how did it go? And they're like, well, I got about 2 words in, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's not a good sign.